March 24, 1976. Before dawn broke over Buenos Aires, the rumble of tanks echoed through empty streets. Telephone exchanges fell silent as military units seized control of communications infrastructure across Argentina. Congress dissolved, political parties banned, unions suppressed, the press silenced. General Jorge Rafael Videla and his fellow officers had overthrown President Isabel Perón. But this was no ordinary coup. The military junta that seized power that morning promised to restore order, defend Western Christian values, and protect Argentina from the threat of international communism. What followed instead was 7 years of state-sponsored terror that would claim tens of thousands of lives and leave scars on Argentine society that remain visible to this day. The generals called their plan the National Reorganization Process, a bureaucratic name that concealed a campaign of systematic violence against the Argentine people. This was the dirty war, though those who lived through it knew there was nothing metaphorical about the bloodshed. It was a war fought not on battlefields, but in secret detention centers, in the back seats of unmarked Ford Falcons, in the interrogation rooms of military facilities, and in the terrified silence of families who woke each morning wondering if today would be the day someone they loved simply vanished. The enemy in this war was not a foreign army or even an organized insurgency. The enemy was anyone the regime decided was subversive, a category that expanded to include students, teachers, journalists, union organizers, social workers, psychologists, priests, nuns, and teenagers whose only crime was attending a protest or joining a school council. To understand how Argentina arrived at this point requires looking back at the turbulent years that preceded the coup. The country had been slowly unraveling throughout the early 1970s, caught in a cycle of political instability, economic crisis, and escalating violence that seemed to feed on itself. The period saw Argentina shift from military rule to the return of Juan Perón from exile, then to the chaotic presidency of his widow Isabel after his death. The country that had once been among the wealthiest in the world, that had prided itself on its educated middle class and cosmopolitan culture, found itself sliding toward civil conflict. Armed left-wing groups had emerged in response to years of military dictatorship and political repression. The Montoneros and the Ejército Revolucionario del Pueblo, the People's Revolutionary Army, carried out kidnappings of business executives and foreign diplomats, assassinations of military officers and police, and bombings of government buildings and corporate offices. These groups saw themselves as revolutionary movements fighting against oligarchy and imperialism, inspired by the Cuban Revolution and the broader leftist movements sweeping Latin America in the 1960s and 1970s. They believed that armed struggle was the only path to fundamental social change in a country where peaceful reform seemed blocked by entrenched elites and military intervention. But the violence was not one-sided. Right-wing death squads, some directly linked to government security services and police units, responded to leftist attacks with their own campaign of terror. The Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, known as AAA, operated with apparent impunity, murdering left-wing activists, intellectuals, and anyone associated with progressive causes. Bodies appeared in streets and vacant lots, bearing signs of torture left as warnings. The message was clear: challenge the established order and you would pay with your life. This paramilitary violence, occurring even before the 1976 coup, established patterns and networks that would later be absorbed into the official machinery of state terror. The economy added fuel to the political fire. Inflation soared into triple digits, eroding savings and wages. Strikes paralyzed industries as workers fought to maintain purchasing power. Capital fled the country. Foreign debt accumulated. The social contract that had defined Argentina since the Peron era, built on state-protected labor, import substitution, industrialization, and some degree of wealth redistribution, seemed to be collapsing. The middle class, once the pride of Argentine society, found itself squeezed between economic insecurity and political violence. Many Argentines, exhausted by chaos and fearful of further deterioration, became receptive to promises of order, even at the cost of democracy. Into this crisis stepped the armed forces, convinced that they alone could save Argentina from destruction. The military had developed a particular worldview, shaped by doctrine learned in staff colleges at home and in counterinsurgency training programs abroad. This doctrine, known as the National Security Doctrine, redefined the nature of warfare in the Cold War era. The enemy was no longer exclusively external, a hostile nation to be fought at the borders. The enemy was now internal, an ideological threat that lived within society itself, that could be your neighbor, your colleague, your student. This enemy did not wear a uniform or carry a flag. It hid in plain sight, spreading subversive ideas, corrupting youth, undermining traditional values, and preparing the ground for communist revolution. The National Security Doctrine taught that this internal war required different methods than conventional warfare. The battlefield was society itself. The goal was not just to defeat armed insurgents, but to cleanse society of subversive thinking, to extirpate what the military called the subversive mentality from the body politic, like a surgeon removing a cancer. This was total war waged against a civilian population, and it would be fought with methods that deliberately operated outside the law, beyond any possibility of accountability or restraint. When the tanks rolled on March 24, 1976, many Argentines who had lived through years of escalating violence actually felt relief. The coup was bloodless. The military promised competence and order. Business leaders and much of the middle class initially supported the intervention, believing that a period of authoritarian rule might be necessary to stabilize the situation before democracy could be restored. Even some who had no love for military dictatorship thought perhaps a brief transition under firm leadership would allow the country to step back from the brink of civil war. They were profoundly, tragically wrong. The junta's chosen instrument for its national reorganization process was terror, systematic and calculated. Security forces and intelligence units, operating with complete impunity, began kidnapping suspected dissidents in operations that followed a terrifying pattern. The vehicle was almost always an unmarked Ford Falcon, a model that became so associated with abductions that the sight of one on the street could inspire panic. Teams of armed men, often in civilian clothes but sometimes in uniform, would seize their targets from bus stops, from classrooms, from workplaces, from hospital corridors, even from their homes in front of their families. The abductions usually happened quickly, violently, with no explanation and no paperwork. One moment a person existed, the next moment they were gone. Those who were taken disappeared into a hidden network of detention centers that operated throughout Argentina. The most notorious was the Navy Mechanics School in Buenos Aires, known by its Spanish acronym ESMA. This facility, located in an upscale neighborhood in full view of passing traffic, became the epicenter of the regime's torture operations. But ESMA was far from alone. Across the country, in cities and towns, the military and police established hundreds of clandestine detention centers. Some were in military bases or police stations. Others were in requisitioned buildings, warehouses, or even rural estates. All shared the same purpose: to break human beings through torture and terror. The conditions in these centers defied imagination, Even decades later, when survivors finally began to speak publicly about their experiences, detainees were kept hooded or blindfolded at all times, disoriented, unable to see their captors or fellow prisoners. They were shackled in painful positions for days or weeks. They were subjected to electric shocks applied to the most sensitive parts of their bodies, to beatings with clubs and fists, to sexual assault and rape, to mock executions where they were told they were about to die, to psychological torture that included playing recordings of other prisoners being tortured or of their own family members being threatened. The purpose was not primarily to extract information, though interrogations did occur. The purpose was destruction, the complete breaking of a human personality, the transformation of thinking, feeling individuals into something less than human. The victims of this machinery of repression represented a cross-section of Argentine society, but with particular patterns that revealed the regime's priorities and paranoia. Students and teachers were heavily targeted, especially those involved in universities where leftist ideas had gained influence in the 1960s and 1970s. The junta saw education as a battleground where the subversive mentality had to be rooted out. Professors who taught sociology or psychology, disciplines considered inherently suspect, were particularly vulnerable. Union organizers and labor activists who had built powerful movements under Peronism were systematically eliminated, destroying the organizational capacity of the Argentine working class. Journalists who had reported critically on the military or on social issues found themselves marked as enemies. Social workers and psychologists who worked in poor neighborhoods were accused of spreading Marxist ideology. The regime's paranoia extended even to the church, traditionally a conservative force in Argentine society. Priests and nuns who had embraced liberation theology, who worked in base communities serving the poor, who took seriously the Catholic social teaching about justice for the oppressed, were denounced as subversives. Several clergy members were among the disappeared, murdered by a regime that claimed to be defending Christian civilization. The contradictions seemed to trouble the generals not at all. Their version of Christianity was one that blessed authority and condemned questioning, that valued order over mercy. Even more chilling was how little it took to be marked as a target. Being listed in an address book or diary of someone already detained could be enough to bring the Ford Falcon to your door. Attending a protest years earlier, even as a curious teenager. Having books on your shelf that the regime considered subversive, which could include works of sociology, progressive theology, or even certain literature. Knowing someone who knew someone who was suspected of involvement with leftist groups. The web of suspicion expanded endlessly, creating a society where trust itself became dangerous, where families feared to discuss politics even in their own homes, where people destroyed photographs and books and anything that might be interpreted as evidence of subversive thinking. In many cases, there were no arrest records, no paperwork, no acknowledgement that the person had ever been detained. This was not an oversight or bureaucratic failure. It was central to the system. The regime deliberately created a category of victims who officially did not exist. When families went to police stations or military offices to inquire about their loved ones, they were met with denial or stonewalling. When they filed writs of habeas corpus, a legal procedure requiring authorities to produce a detained person before a court, these writs simply accumulated unanswered in court offices, while judges looked away. The regime sometimes warned relatives to stop asking questions for their own good, a barely veiled threat that they might disappear too if they persisted. This created the phenomenon of the Desaparecidos, the disappeared, a category unique in its horror. These were people who existed in a terrible limbo. Their families could not grieve them as dead because they might still be alive somewhere in the network of detention centers. But they could not hope for their return through any legal process because the state insisted they had never been detained. The psychological torture inflicted on the families of the disappeared, the endless uncertainty and helpless searching, was itself a form of state terror that affected hundreds of thousands of Argentines. The disappearances were not random acts of violence or the chaotic byproduct of repression. They were a carefully calculated tactic designed to maximize terror while minimizing accountability. The regime understood that political prisoners with trials became martyrs, that executions created symbols around which opposition could rally, that acknowledged detention created records that could later be used as evidence of crimes. Disappearance solved all these problems from the regime's perspective. There would be no martyrdom if there was no acknowledged death. There would be no public outcry if the state maintained that nothing had happened. There would be no evidence trail if the victims simply ceased to exist in official records. The methods of disposal revealed the systematic nature of the horror. Many bodies were buried in unmarked mass graves in cemeteries, mixed with unidentified bodies or listed under false names. Others were cremated, reducing human remains to ash that could be scattered and lost forever. But perhaps the most chilling method was what became known as the death flights. Prisoners who had been tortured for weeks or months, who had been broken physically and psychologically, who had given their interrogators whatever information they possessed, were told they were being transferred to another facility. They would be loaded onto military transport aircraft, often still hooded or blindfolded. Once over the Rio de la Plata or the Atlantic Ocean, they would be drugged into unconsciousness or simply thrown out of the aircraft alive, plummeting into the water to drown. Sometimes the sea returned bodies to shore, corpses that washed up on beaches bearing signs of torture. More often, the ocean kept its secrets. The brutality extended to pregnant women, a particular cruelty that combined multiple forms of violation. Women detained while pregnant, or who became pregnant through rape in detention, were kept alive until they gave birth. The military operated a system where these babies, born in captivity, were seized immediately after birth and given to military families or families approved by the regime. The children were registered with false birth certificates, given new identities, raised by the very people who had murdered their parents. The biological mothers, their only value to the regime exhausted once they had given birth, were typically killed shortly after delivery. Their bodies were disappeared like the others. The stolen children grew up not knowing their true identities, their true families, their history. This systematic theft of identity represented a form of genocide, the deliberate destruction of a group by preventing the transmission of identity to the next generation. Estimates of the disappeared vary, shaped by political debates that continue to this day. The official Truth Commission, established after the dictatorship, documented approximately 9,000 cases where detailed evidence existed. Human rights organizations placed the number higher, around 30,000, based on reports that include cases where documentation was destroyed or was never created. The true number will never be known with certainty because the regime deliberately avoided creating records that could later incriminate them. What is beyond dispute is that thousands of Argentines vanished, that hundreds of children were stolen, that torture was systematic and widespread, and that this occurred with the knowledge and approval of the highest levels of the military government. Yet from the very beginning, even in the depths of terror, Argentines resisted. In April 1977, just over a year after the coup, a few women began gathering in Buenos Aires' Plaza de Mayo, the historic square facing the presidential palace. These were mothers of the disappeared, women desperate for information about their children. Public gatherings were banned under the state of siege that the Junta had declared. Simply congregating in public could lead to arrest. But these mothers understood that staying silent meant accepting their children's disappearance, meant letting the regime erase them from history without trace. The women developed a simple but powerful tactic. They walked slowly in circles around the central monument in the plaza, moving rather than standing still, technically complying with the ban on gatherings while still creating a visible presence. They wore white headscarves on their heads, pieces of cloth that had once been their children's diapers, transformed into symbols of maternal love and defiance. They carried photographs of the disappeared, refusing to let their children become abstract statistics. They demanded answers. Where are they? What happened to them? The questions were simple but devastating to the regime's carefully constructed denial. The junta tried various approaches to suppress the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. Officials dismissed them as las locas, the crazy women, suggesting that grief had driven them mad and that no one should take their claims seriously. Security forces infiltrated the group, and several of the founding mothers were themselves disappeared, including Azucena, Villaflor, one of the most prominent leaders. These murders were meant to terrorize the others into silence. Instead, they strengthened the resolve of those who remained. If the regime was willing to kill mothers simply for asking about their children, the mothers reasoned, then clearly the children were being held or had been killed, and clearly the regime had something to hide. The disappearances of the mothers themselves became evidence of the larger crime. Week after week, the mothers returned to the plaza. Their presence broke the silence that the dictatorship had imposed on Argentine society. They made disappearance visible, transformed it from an individual family tragedy hidden behind closed doors into a public scandal that could not be ignored. Their courage inspired others. Gradually, the circle of protesters grew. Other family members joined, fathers, siblings, and particularly the grandmothers, the Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, who focused specifically on finding the stolen children. The Abuelas faced a unique challenge. They were searching for grandchildren they had often never met, children who had been born in captivity or stolen as infants. These children were being raised under false identities by families who would never willingly reveal the truth. The Abuelas developed a systematic approach, gathering evidence about pregnant women who had been detained, tracking rumors of babies given to military families, building databases of potential stolen children, and eventually, as the science developed, using DNA testing to prove biological relationships. Their persistence was extraordinary. They turned themselves into amateur detectives, lawyers, and advocates, learning whatever skills they needed to continue the search. The mothers and grandmothers succeeded in doing what seemed impossible under a military dictatorship that controlled all media and prohibited all dissent. They internationalized the story of the disappeared. Foreign journalists, initially hesitant to report on unverified claims, began to take the allegations seriously as the mothers provided documentation and testimony. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and church groups, started investigating Argentine disappearances. The mothers traveled abroad when they could, speaking at universities and international forums, carrying photographs and testimonies. They turned Argentina's dirty war into an international scandal, creating external pressure that the regime found increasingly difficult to ignore. The dirty war was not solely an Argentine phenomenon. It was part of a coordinated regional effort called Operation Condor, a secret intelligence sharing and mutual assistance pact among the military dictatorships of South America's southern cone. Starting in the mid-1970s, the military governments of Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and later Brazil created a network that allowed them to track down exiles, trade prisoners, and coordinate assassinations across international borders. A Uruguayan dissident who had fled to Buenos Aires was not safe. An Argentine leftist who sought refuge in Santiago could be arrested by Chilean security forces and rendered back to Argentina. The borders that should have provided protection became transparent to the coordinated intelligence services of allied dictatorships. Operation Condor represented a remarkable example of how Cold War logic erased traditional notions of sovereignty and human rights. These were supposedly independent nations, but they treated political dissidents as a shared enemy that transcended nationality. If you were on Argentina's list of subversives, you became a target for all Condor members, regardless of where you fled. This created a continental detention system where exile, traditionally a form of escape from persecution, provided no safety. Declassified documents later revealed that the United States government was aware of Condor's operations from early on. American intelligence observed the development of this system, where anti-communist allies hunted their enemies without regard for borders or laws, and chose not to interfere, seeing it as compatible with broader Cold War objectives of containing leftist movements in the Western Hemisphere. Inside Argentina, the Junta fought a second war alongside its war against subversion, an economic war. The regime appointed José Alfredo Martínez de Hoz as economy minister, a representative of Argentina's traditional economic elite with close ties to international financial institutions. Martínez de Hoz implemented a program of radical market liberalization that represented a sharp break from the economic policies that had defined Argentina since the Perón era. The new policies deregulated financial markets, opened Argentina to foreign imports, privatized state assets, removed protections for domestic industry, and sought to attract foreign investment by making Argentina business-friendly according to the standards of international capital. In the short term, these measures succeeded in controlling the runaway inflation that had plagued Isabel Perón's government. Middle-class Argentines could suddenly afford imported consumer goods that had been unavailable or prohibitively expensive. There was a brief euphoria, a sense that Argentina was rejoining the modern world after years of crisis. But the long-term consequences were devastating. Removing tariff protections meant that Argentine industries could not compete with cheaper foreign goods. Factories closed. Unemployment rose. The peso was deliberately overvalued to control inflation, which made imports cheap but destroyed export competitiveness. Foreign debt ballooned as the government borrowed to finance its operations, and as private businesses borrowed from international banks, flush with petrodollars. The economic program was not separate from the repression, but deeply connected to it. The social movements that had gained strength in the 1960s and 1970s, the powerful unions that demanded high wages and worker protections, the leftist intellectuals who criticized capitalism and imperialism, the student movements that challenged elite control of education, all these forces that might have resisted economic liberalization were being systematically destroyed by the security apparatus. Breaking the unions was not just about defeating leftist ideology. It was about clearing the way for an economic transformation that shifted wealth and power upward toward Argentina's traditional elites and outward toward international capital. Repression made liberalization possible. The dirty war against subversives and the economic war against the Peronist social model were two aspects of the same project. The international response to Argentina's dictatorship reflected the contradictions and calculations of Cold War geopolitics. In the immediate aftermath of the 1976 coup, Top officials in the United States government, still in the final months of the Gerald Ford administration, showed understanding and even support for the new regime. The calculation was familiar to anyone who had followed U.S. policy in Latin America for decades. A friendly authoritarian government that suppressed leftist movements and maintained stability was preferable to a democratic government that might be vulnerable to Cuban influence or Soviet penetration. Order mattered more than liberty. Stability trumped human rights. The generals were anti-communist, and in the zero-sum logic of the Cold War, that made them allies regardless of what they did to their own people. This position was challenged when Jimmy Carter became president in January 1977. Carter had made human rights a centerpiece of his foreign policy, arguing that American support for dictatorships contradicted stated American values and ultimately undermined U.S. interests by associating America with repression. The Carter administration cut certain military aid programs to Argentina, pressed the Junta for information about the disappeared, supported investigations by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and raised human rights issues in diplomatic contacts. This represented a significant shift in rhetoric and somewhat in practice. Argentine military officers found themselves facing questions and criticism from their traditional ally. However, the underlying strategic framework did not fundamentally change even under Carter. The United States continued to view Latin America primarily through a Cold War lens, where the paramount concern was preventing leftist governments that might align with Cuba or the Soviet Union. When strategic interests conflicted with human rights concerns, strategy generally prevailed. Military aid was reduced, but not eliminated. Intelligence sharing continued. The relationship remained fundamentally cooperative even as the Carter administration publicly criticized Argentine human rights violations. When Ronald Reagan took office in January 1981, even the rhetorical emphasis on human rights largely disappeared. The Reagan administration prioritized anti-communist unity and saw the Southern Cone dictatorships as valuable partners in the global struggle against Soviet influence. Argentine officers, with their experience in counterinsurgency and their demonstrated willingness to use harsh methods, became valuable contacts and advisors as the United States intensified its involvement in Central America, supporting right-wing governments and Contra forces against leftist insurgencies in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. The contradiction became explicit and undeniable. A government condemned by international human rights organizations for disappearing thousands of its own citizens could simultaneously be regarded as a partner and advisor to the United States when fighting a common enemy. By the early 1980s, the Argentine junta's legitimacy, always fragile and sustained primarily through fear, began to crack. The economic miracle promised by Martínez de Hoz had proven illusory. Foreign debt soared into the tens of billions of dollars. Inflation, temporarily controlled, climbed again as the fundamental structural problems of the economy remained unaddressed. Unemployment rose as industries collapsed under import competition. The brief boom in consumer spending, fueled by foreign borrowing and an overvalued peso, gave way to renewed crisis. The economic program that was supposed to modernize Argentina had instead weakened its productive base and mortgaged its future. Internal fissures within the military also widened. The armed forces had never been entirely unified. Rivalries existed between branches, Army versus Navy versus Air Force, each with its own institutional interests and perspectives. Within branches, factions divided between hardliners who wanted to maintain repression indefinitely and alleged moderates who recognized that the dictatorship had to eventually transition back to some form of civilian rule. Personal ambitions and resentments accumulated. Different commanders had different visions for Argentina's future. As the economic situation deteriorated and the regime's promise of restored order rang hollow, these internal conflicts became more acute. In December 1981, General Leopoldo Galtieri rose to power within the junta through this internal maneuvering. He represented the army and displaced the Navy-dominated leadership that had preceded him. Galtieri promised to resolve the regime's mounting crises through a combination of economic adjustment and renewed legitimacy. He found his answer to the legitimacy problem in nationalism, specifically in the dispute over the Falkland Islands, known in Argentina as Las Malvinas. The Falkland Islands, a remote archipelago in the South Atlantic, had been controlled by Britain since 1833, but claimed by Argentina based on Spanish colonial-era rights and geographic proximity. The dispute had simmered for nearly 150 years, periodically rising in Argentine political discourse, but never escalating to military conflict. For most of that time, the issue was more symbolic than practical. But Galtieri, facing economic collapse and eroding military unity, saw in the Malvinas question an opportunity to unite Argentines behind the dictatorship through nationalist fervor. On April 2, 1982, Argentina launched Operation Rosario and invaded the Falkland Islands. The small British garrison was quickly overwhelmed by Argentine forces. The islands were occupied, the Argentine flag raised, and Galtieri appeared on the balcony of the Casa Rosada to address massive crowds that had gathered in the Plaza de Mayo. The scene was remarkable and deeply ironic. The same plaza where the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo had walked in silent protest, facing harassment and detention, now filled with cheering Argentines celebrating what they saw as the recovery of national territory. Even many opponents of the dictatorship felt the pull of anti-colonial sentiment and supported the recovery of the Malvinas. For a brief moment, the regime achieved the national unity it had sought through 7 years of repression. But the euphoria was built on a catastrophic miscalculation. The junta had assumed that Britain, thousands of miles away and preoccupied with its own economic problems, would protest diplomatically, but ultimately accept the fait accompli rather than fight a war over remote islands with a tiny population. They had completely misread both British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's determination and Britain's military capability to project power across the globe. Within days of the invasion, Thatcher ordered a naval task force to sail for the South Atlantic to retake the islands by force. The war that followed was brief but intense. British forces, despite fighting at the extreme range of their logistical capacity, demonstrated superior training, equipment, and tactics. Argentine forces, many of them young conscripts with minimal training rather than professional soldiers, fought bravely in many instances but were outmatched. The naval and air battles showed the technological gap between the two forces. When British troops landed and began fighting their way across the islands toward the capital Port Stanley, Argentine resistance, though sometimes fierce, could not prevent the steady British advance. On June 14, 1982, after 74 days of occupation, Argentine forces surrendered. The defeat was total and humiliating. Over 650 Argentine soldiers had died, many of them conscripts barely out of their teens. The professional military that had styled itself as the savior of the nation, that had justified its seizure of power by claiming superior competence and strategic vision, had led Argentina into a disastrous military adventure that ended in defeat. The contrast with the dirty war was stark and bitter. The military had proven ruthlessly effective at torturing unarmed civilians in secret detention centers, but incompetent at fighting a conventional war against a professional military force. The political consequences were immediate. Galtieri resigned within days of the surrender. General Rinaldo Bignone took over as president with the understanding that his primary mission was to manage the military's withdrawal from power. The dictatorship had lost its last shred of legitimacy. The economic crisis that the Malvinas adventure was supposed to distract from remained. The disappeared had not been explained or accounted for, and now the military had added military defeat to its list of failures. Over the following months, as the reality of the defeat sank in and recriminations flew within the armed forces, the junta began preparing for a transition back to civilian rule. The military hoped to negotiate a pact that would protect them from future prosecution. They wanted guarantees that the dirty war would be treated as a closed chapter, that officers who had carried out repression would not face legal consequences, that the transition to democracy would come with amnesty. They tried to destroy evidence, burning documents that detailed detention operations and eliminating records that could later be used to prove crimes. In their final months in power, they passed a self-amnesty law declaring that actions taken in the fight against subversion could not be prosecuted. But unlike in some other Latin American transitions, the Argentine military's defeat in the Falklands had so thoroughly discredited them that they lacked the power to impose their preferred terms on the transition. Political parties that had been banned since 1976 re-emerged and began organizing for elections. Newspapers tested their newfound freedom cautiously at first, then with increasing boldness. Society began speaking openly about issues that had been whispered for years, or not discussed at all. The return of democracy was not smooth or certain. The military retained weapons and institutional power. There were fears of another coup if the transition moved too quickly or threatened military interests too directly. But the momentum toward democracy, once begun, proved difficult to reverse. On October 30th, 1983, Argentina held elections. Raul Alfonsin of the Radical Civic Union won the presidency, defeating the Peronist candidate. This itself was remarkable. Peronism had dominated Argentine politics for decades. That voters chose a different path suggested a desire for a clean break with the past, since some Peronist figures had been complicit in the violence that preceded the 1976 coup. Democracy was formally restored on December 10, 1983, when Alfonsin took office. After 7 years of military dictatorship, Argentina had civilian government again. But the transition raised questions that would define Argentine politics for decades. How to deal with the crimes of the dictatorship. How to balance justice with stability. How to prevent the military from intervening again. Alfonsin faced a dilemma common to every transition from dictatorship to democracy. He needed to establish that the new democratic order was based on law and justice, that the crimes of the dictatorship would not simply be forgotten or excused. But he also needed to avoid provoking a military backlash that could destroy the fragile democracy. The armed forces still existed, still had weapons, still had officers who believed they had done nothing wrong in fighting subversion. If pressed too hard, they might attempt another coup. Finding the balance between justice and stability was the central challenge of the transition. Alfonsin's approach was to pursue justice, but in a controlled, measured way. He established a Truth Commission, the National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons, known as CONADEP. The commission was charged with investigating disappearances, gathering testimony from survivors and families, documenting the machinery of repression, and producing a comprehensive report on what had happened during the Dirty War. The commission worked for 9 months, taking testimony from thousands of witnesses, visiting former detention centers, compiling evidence. The result was a report titled Nunca Más, Never Again, published in 1984. The Nunca Más report documented approximately 9,000 cases of disappearance where detailed evidence could be established. It described the network of detention centers, the methods of torture, the death flights, the theft of children. It named perpetrators and detailed the command structure that had ordered and supervised the repression. The report made clear that the Dirty War was not a chaotic period of random violence or the unauthorized actions of rogue officers. It was a systematic policy planned and executed from the highest levels of the military command. The publication of Nunca Más was itself a revolutionary act. The disappeared, whom the dictatorship had tried to erase from history and memory, were being named and remembered. Their stories were being recorded officially. The state that had denied their existence now acknowledged, through its democratic government, what had been done to them. But Alfonsin went further than just documentation. In an unprecedented move, he put the junta's top leaders on trial in civilian courts. This had rarely been attempted anywhere. Military officers who had ruled a country were being tried for crimes committed while in power, not by a revolutionary tribunal or a military court, but by the ordinary civilian justice system. The trials began in 1985 and continued for months. Survivors testified about their torture and detention, describing in devastating detail what had been done to them. Families testified about the disappearance of their loved ones. Even some perpetrators testified, either seeking reduced sentences or attempting to justify their actions. The testimony was broadcast and reported extensively. Argentines sat in their homes and heard about the reality of the detention centers, the torture, the death flights, the stolen babies. Much of this had been suspected or rumored during the dictatorship, but now it was being stated under oath in open court, with the full authority of evidence. The trials served as a form of national truth-telling, forcing Argentine society to confront what had been done in their name, under governments they had initially supported, or at least tolerated. In December 1985, the court delivered its verdicts. Jorge Rafael Videla and Admiral Emilio Massera, two of the junta's most powerful figures, received life sentences. Other junta members received terms ranging from 4.5 to 17 years. The convictions sent a powerful message. The dirty war had been criminal, its leaders were being held accountable, and Argentina's democracy was based on the rule of law. For a moment, it seemed that Argentina was accomplishing what few countries had managed, a genuine reckoning with dictatorship and state terror through legitimate legal processes. But the path of justice proved neither straight nor complete. The trials of the junta leaders unleashed demands for prosecuting the many officers and officials at lower levels who had actually carried out torture and killings. Hundreds of cases were filed. The prospect of widespread prosecutions alarmed the military. Officers who thought they had acted under orders, who believed they had fought a war and should be treated as soldiers rather than criminals, felt betrayed. In 1987, elements of the military staged uprisings, occupying bases and demanding an end to prosecutions. These uprisings did not attempt to overthrow democracy entirely, but they made clear that the military would not accept unlimited accountability. Facing this pressure, and fearing that the democratic transition could be destabilized, the Alfonsin government and Congress passed two controversial laws. The Full Stop Law in 1986 set a deadline for filing new criminal complaints, effectively preventing prosecution of most officers below the highest command level. The Due Obedience Law in 1987 established a presumption that officers below a certain rank had been following orders and therefore could not be held criminally responsible. These laws protected hundreds of officers who had participated in torture, kidnapping, and murder from facing trial. For the families of victims and for human rights organizations, it felt like a second betrayal. the democratic government prioritizing political stability over justice. The retreat from accountability went even further in the 1990s. President Carlos Menem, seeking to improve relations with the military and end what he called the divisive focus on the past, issued presidential pardons in 1989 and 1990. These pardons freed even those who had been convicted in the 1985 trials, including Videla and Massera. Within a few years of the democratic transition, essentially no one was in prison for crimes of the dictatorship. The perpetrators of the dirty war had achieved through political pressure and legal maneuvering the impunity they had failed to secure through their self-amnesty law. Yet the story did not end there. History, once made public, proved difficult to suppress. The human rights organizations, particularly the mothers and grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, never stopped demanding justice. They continued their weekly walks in the plaza, carrying photographs of the disappeared, refusing to let Argentine society forget. A new generation grew up reading Nunca Más in schools, visiting memorials built at former detention centers, learning what had happened. Internationally, the principle of universal jurisdiction meant that some Argentine officers traveling abroad faced arrest for crimes against humanity. The issue would not simply disappear because pardons had been issued. In the early 2000s, Argentina's legal and political landscape shifted dramatically. The Supreme Court, with new justices appointed by governments more committed to human rights, declared in 2005 that the full stop and due obedience laws were unconstitutional. The laws had violated international human rights obligations that Argentina had accepted. They were void, had always been void, and therefore the prosecutions they had blocked could proceed. The presidential pardons were also challenged and eventually annulled. The doors to justice, closed in the late 1980s and 1990s, were reopened. Trials resumed and have continued to this day. Hundreds of former military officers, police officials, and civilians who collaborated with the dictatorship have been tried and convicted for crimes including kidnapping, torture, murder, and theft of children. The proceedings are slow, often taking years as evidence is gathered and witnesses located. Some perpetrators have died before facing trial. The process remains incomplete and imperfect, but it represents something nearly unique in the world: a sustained, decades-long effort by a democracy to hold accountable those who committed mass atrocities while holding state power. Argentina has demonstrated that even when justice is delayed, even when impunity seems to have prevailed, societies can choose to reopen the question and demand accountability. The grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo have achieved remarkable success in their specific mission of finding the stolen children. Through DNA testing, comparison of biological samples, careful investigation, and the cooperation of some adopted children who suspected their identities had been falsified, over 130 individuals have been identified and reunited with their biological families. These reunions, often occurring when the stolen children are adults in their 30s or 40s, are both joyful and traumatic. The individuals learn that their entire identity was a lie, that the parents who raised them were connected to the murder of their biological parents. They must reconcile love for the people who raised them with horror at how they came to be in that family. The work continues, as dozens of stolen children remain unidentified. The Argentine case must be understood within the broader context of Cold War Latin America. Argentina was not alone in experiencing military dictatorship and state terror during this period. Brazil underwent a military regime from 1964 to 1985. Chile suffered under Augusto Pinochet from 1973 to 1990. Uruguay had its own dictatorship from 1973 to 1985. Paraguay endured Alfredo Stroessner from 1954 to 1989. Across the region, military regimes implemented similar doctrines, used similar methods, and justified their actions with similar rhetoric about defending Western Christian civilization against communist subversion. These regimes shared more than ideology. They shared training. As Latin American military officers attended courses at U.S. facilities, including the School of the Americas, where counterinsurgency doctrine was taught. They shared intelligence through Operation Condor and other networks. They shared political cover from Cold War alliance structures, where anti-communist credentials excused human rights violations. The dirty war in Argentina was part of a hemispheric pattern where the Cold War became a license for state violence against civilian populations. Yet Argentina also became a symbol of something else, the possibility of reckoning and accountability. While Chile granted Pinochet immunity, and Brazil passed broad amnesty laws that remain largely unchallenged, Argentina kept pushing toward justice. The contrast shows that outcomes of transitions from dictatorship are not predetermined. They depend on the strength of civil society, the courage of human rights advocates, the decisions of judges and legislators, and ultimately on whether a society chooses to remember or forget. The dirty war's legacy continues to shape Argentina. Debates over memory and justice recur in every election cycle. Some argue that the focus on the past divides the country, that Argentina needs to move forward rather than constantly revisiting trauma. Others insist that only through full accounting of what happened can Argentina ensure it never happens again. These debates sometimes split families and communities. The mothers still walk in the Plaza de Mayo every Thursday afternoon, though their numbers have diminished as age takes its toll. Their presence remains a weekly reminder to Buenos Aires and to Argentina that the past is not past, that memory is an active choice. The disappeared left an absence that can never be filled. They were students who would never finish their degrees, workers who would never retire, parents who would never see their children grow up, children who never had the chance to become adults. They were poets and engineers, nurses and teachers, dreamers and organizers. Their potential, their futures, the families they would have formed, the contributions they would have made, all were stolen. The dictatorship tried to erase them completely, but through the determination of those who refused to forget, they remain present in Argentine national consciousness. Argentina's experience raises enduring questions about the Cold War itself. What did it mean for a global ideological conflict to be waged not primarily through confrontation between superpowers, but through violence within nations? Violence directed by governments against their own people. How did the rhetoric of defending freedom and civilization become justification for torture, disappearance, and murder? What responsibilities do the United States and other powers bear for supporting, training, and providing cover for regimes that committed mass atrocities? These questions extend far beyond Argentina, but Argentina's particular combination of extreme violence and eventual accountability makes it a crucial case for examining them. The mothers and grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo taught the world something about courage and persistence. They were ordinary women, not trained activists or professional organizers, who found themselves thrust into extraordinary circumstances when their children disappeared. They had every reason to stay silent and safe. The regime made clear that continued agitation meant risking their own disappearance. Many people who knew what was happening chose silence, the rational choice for survival. But these women chose differently. They chose to make the private grief of losing a child into a public demand for justice. They chose to walk in circles in a plaza, wearing headscarves and carrying photographs week after week, year after year, through dictatorship and democracy, never stopping, never forgetting. Their example inspired human rights movements worldwide. The image of the mothers in their white headscarves became a symbol of resistance to state terror. Their tactics, simple but powerful, were adopted by other movements facing repression. Their insistence on making the disappeared visible, on refusing to accept that people who had existed could simply be erased, created a model for how families of victims could organize and create political pressure even under authoritarian regimes. The Plaza de Mayo became sacred ground, a place where dictatorship was defied and memory was kept alive. The Dirty War ended in 1983, but its questions remain relevant. How does a society balance security with liberty? When does the state's legitimate monopoly on violence become state terrorism? How do we recognize when language about defending civilization and order becomes cover for atrocity? Argentina went further than most countries in trying to answer these questions through courts, memorials, education, and ongoing public reckoning. The process is imperfect and incomplete, but it represents a sustained commitment to the principle that even crimes committed by those holding state power remain crimes, that immunity is not inevitable, and that memory is both a civic duty and a form of resistance to future tyranny. The Dirty War's dead cannot be brought back. The years of terror cannot be undone. But Argentina has written an ending that the generals never imagined. Testimony entered into the record, judgments made in open court, stolen children meeting their biological families, memorials built on sites of torture, school groups visiting to learn what happened and why. This is Argentina's answer to the question of how to move forward from state terror. Not through forgetting, not through imposed amnesia or granted impunity, but through sustained, difficult, often painful engagement with truth and accountability. Nunca más, never again, is not just a statement about the past. It is a commitment renewed with each trial, each Thursday walk, each recovered identity, each generation taught the history that some would prefer to forget.